and welcome back to the Bodyful Minds Podcast. If you've been following the last 2 episodes, thank you so much. We've been diving deep into what it means to be grounded as a mother and how internal as well as external barriers play a role in both challenge and growth. Today we pull those threads together and look at a broader lens. Your circles of power, what you can control, what you can influence, and what's outside of both. Because as ambitious mums, not only are the stakes high and sometimes the clutter of what we cannot change drains so much energy, but also time is precious and you want to spend it on what you can change. This episode is about clarity, about respecting limits, and about leaning into what you can do, so that over time, the ripple of all of us doing that may shift the bigger things too. The framework that I'm going to use for this originally comes from Stephen Covey in his book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. Covey describes 2 circles, the circle of concern and the circle of influence. And later interpretations add a 3rd circle, which is called the circle of control, or what I like to call the circle of agency. Let's start with the circle of concern. These are all the things you care about and that affect you more or less directly too, like workplace policies, politics, societal expectations. And then there's another circle. So imagine that if you imagine it as a graphic, you've got the big circle, that's the circle of concern, then the next smaller circle within it, which is the circle of influence. And these are things you can somewhat shape, but they are not fully under your control. So these are family routines, how you show up in relationships. You can always only control your part in all of that, but you cannot control what the other people you're interacting with do. So also your communication, you can partly control that, but what the other person perceives or understands from what you're saying, for example, you don't have control over, right? So that is the circle of influence. And then there's another smaller circle within that medium circle, which is the circle of control or the circle of agency. And these are the things that are under your direct power. For example, your habits, the way you ground yourself, you connect to yourself, how you take care of your body, and your mindset. So let's apply this theory or this model to the topic of the last 2 episodes. In the first episode of this mini-series, which is episode number 35 of the podcast, we looked at some inner resistance and beliefs and how to ground yourself to identify them as such and work through them. So this is part of your circle of control. And in the second part of the series, I go into what we know affects ambitious mothers, like pay and pension gap, motherhood penalty, and so much more. So basically where the system is stacked against us. And that is the circle of concern because it's important to us. It affects us directly as mothers. And so in this episode, I want to briefly touch on the circle of influence because I haven't touched on that a lot in the previous episodes, as well as to give you the full picture of the concept. Differentiating these circles matters because it empowers you to put your energy where it really counts and thus helps reduce guilt and can prevent burnout. And so what does this look like in real life? Let me give you 2 concrete examples. I'm sure you've been in this situation. Your toddler melts down, maybe even in the middle of a supermarket, and you feel your nervous system flooding with your child's big feelings, with the projected thoughts of onlookers, and with your own inner voice shouting, "I don't like this, make it stop." You cannot control your child's meltdown, but you can ground yourself. It's difficult, especially in that situations where you've got onlookers, but, pausing to breathe, softening your body, or reframing your expectations. That way you hold space for your child's feelings and co-regulate instead of spiraling into meltdown mode yourself. This is a perfect example of both circle of agency, because you can control how you react, and circle of influence, because you're providing a space for your child. You're there with your child and you're helping it through the big feelings. And if you do slip into autopilot and lose it in the moment, that doesn't mean failure. It just means you have another chance to practice next time. Now let's look at another example. You've come back from maternity leave a while ago. You've worked really hard to get back into the saddle, maybe learn about new systems and new practices. And you've done all this despite the lack of sleep and everything that comes with being a new mom. And before your baby, you were on track for the next career step, and now you want to pick up where you left off, right? Only to notice that all of a sudden, your efficiency and results at work are taken for granted, and there's no more talk about a promotion. You won't immediately change the workplace culture or the bias that mothers aren't promotion material, but you can choose to be intentional about what extra work you accept, how you show up, how you network with colleagues and make allies. You can be grounded in knowing your value rather than waiting for someone else to see it. And you can actively ask for a promotion or at least start a conversation with your boss about it. So it's all about how you frame what you're doing. And that depends on knowing what you can influence and what you can't influence. So in this example, obviously, like I mentioned before, but I didn't make it explicit, so I want to go back to that quickly. The workplace culture is the circle of concern, and to some degree, it is also part of the circle of influence, because obviously you're part of the work culture, and if you find allies, you can, and you are stronger as a group, you can influence that. But I'll come back to the weaknesses of the model later. So. We need to see this as a tool that we use when we need it, when it's helpful, but that also has got limits, right? But we'll get back to that later. Let's look at applying this model and how it's helpful. So you do this at home. Map your circles, draw 3 concentric circles and list your concerns in the outer circle, and then the influences in the middle circle, and then the controls in the innermost circle. And you can then think about, where do you spend most of your mental and emotional energy? And is that the place where you should spend it? Because now you're differentiating between this is something I can influence or can't influence. This is something I can actually control rather than only influence. Or is it something that is mostly out of my direct influence and only is affecting me? And importantly, with that, you can decide to protect your core. So the middle circle. So what you can control. To use small rituals and to set boundaries and to use grounding practices to strengthen your control zone. And with that, your energy. And lastly, you can also think about how can you expand your influence. And in the second example that I mentioned above, that could be finding allies and to change the workplace culture in the long run, right? This could be like small, consistent actions. Like I said just now, advocating for yourself, joining collective efforts, and modeling presence. And this can shift influence over time. So what was before just a concern could become at least partly part of that circle of influence. But I alluded to this before. This model is powerful and very applicable as it guides your way back to yourself, namely to the circle of agency. And it helps you align your energy with your values and where you can have the biggest impact. But with all models, there are some things to remember that can affect how useful this tool is for you personally or for you in a specific situation. So firstly, underestimating or overestimating influence. People sometimes misplace what they could influence or overreach into things they really can't change. So that is something you got to be aware of. You could discuss that, for example, if you're mapping it out for your workplace, you can discuss with a colleague you trust for how they perceive it if you want to kind of check your own perception. And then obviously models always oversimplify. Real life is much more blurry. And like I said before, for example, the workplace culture is kind of hovering between concern because there are some things you can't influence that affect workplace culture, and some things will be in your circle of influence, right? So it's not as clear cut as that. But it can also be helpful to realize that some things, some aspects of a certain area are within your influence while others are outside of your influence. And it can shift. So what's in one circle today may shift tomorrow. And then there are cultural and systemic constraints. So the model assumes a lot of individual agency, but context matters. For mothers, childcare gaps, systemic bias, or economic pressures can make the inner circles feel very tight. And it can feel like there's actually not an awful lot that you can control. But I think using this model might actually help you realize that there is more you can control than you previously thought or felt like. So it also helps with a feeling of autonomy. And then lastly, there might be a risk of self-blame. So if we are not careful, the model can make moms maybe feel guilty for not expanding their influence enough. But for me personally, this is not about expanding influence, really. So the way I would use this as a tool also in coaching practice is to think about empowerment, to realize maybe that there's more that you can control or influence than you think on the one hand, but also to just realize, okay, this is something I can't influence. So either I've got to live with it or I've got to find a way of avoiding it. Let's say if workplace culture is really bad and, you don't click with anybody, you can't find allies, and it's really bringing you down, then maybe that's a sign that the company or organization you're working for is not right for you. And then you can start from there, say, okay, well, for now I need to accept this. I'll try to move on. I'll try to find another job. So it's not necessarily with a view to expanding the influence, but to realize what you can and what you can't change, and to make decisions based on that to protect yourself and your energy, and with that, your mental health and also your family's well-being. So yeah, let's definitely remember, please, this is just a tool. It's not a rule book. Be gentle if you want to apply it, and the circles shift. So, you can do it in different areas of your life, different things you're struggling with maybe, or things that are like kind of on repeat in your head and you're trying to solve this, and maybe look at it and see, well, if I keep thinking about it and nothing changes, what of this is actually within my control, within my influence, and what is actually out of my control or influence. And ultimately, even small ripples add up. So if you change something within your circle of control, that will have an effect on how you show up at work, how you feel, how you can manage your energy, how you interact with your children, and so on. But most importantly, tools are just that. You take them out of the box as you need them and put them away when you don't. So focusing on your control, for example, by grounding yourself, by setting boundaries, that sustains you. Working with your influence, like in family dynamics or while, working within your team, creates resilience buffers. And understanding your concerns, so the systems, the things that affect you but that you cannot directly change, gives you perspective. And yes, they're huge, but change begins in small steps. The more of us who do that, the more the system itself will shift. So here's what I hope you take with you today. Firstly, clarity. Know what's control, what's influence, what's concern. Secondly, permission. Let go of what you can't affect directly. Focus on what's within your control and within your influence. And lastly, commitment. Act where you can, consistently and compassionately. Mama, you may not change the system overnight, but every time you choose grounding over guilt, agency over helplessness, and influence over frustration, you are shaping the world your children will grow up in. This week, try this. Pick one thing in your control to double down on, and one thing in your influence to experiment with. Share it with someone close, or, I'd love to hear from you too, if you feel like it. And with that, we wrap up this 3-part mini-series on the circles of control, concern, and influence. I hope it has given you clarity, courage, and a bit more compassion for yourself as you navigate ambition and motherhood. Until next time, I hope you stay grounded, wise in your energy, and courageous in the circles you influence. You've got this. More you, less noise.